Hello, and welcome to the opening lecture of the Course of Action series of Stevens Institute of Technology. My name is Gregory Prastakos, and I'm the Dean of the School of Business here at Stevens. The objective of the series is to bring you the expertise of the Stevens faculty, whose research, teaching, and service experience offer valuable insights and guidance to help us navigate in today's unprecedented crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to thank all the faculty who are giving these lectures, as well as Joe Arney and Michael Zumulen, who have been guiding the production of the series. Now, I'm happy to introduce Professor Peter Dominick, who will kick off our series. Dr. Dominick is an organizational psychologist who studies effective leadership, and his insights are brought directly to bear at some of the world's most prestigious companies who engage him in leadership development activities for high performers. In times of crisis, the best leaders find ways to tap into resilience and compassion, to better connect with people on their teams, even as constant waves of change disrupt the organization and the world. Professor Dominick, in his talk, will show you practical ways to do this effectively. This series continues for 8 weeks, and I do hope you will continue to participate. Please register for other talks in the series at courseofaction.tech. For now, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Pete Dominick.
Well, thanks, Gregory, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. I hope you and the people you care about are well these days, these unusual times we're all facing. Thanks, too, for joining me here in the supermarket. We're starting here because I wanted to share a story with you about something that happened to me not too long ago when I was out shopping. I went to the store to purchase the things that we needed to get through the week. Entering the store, perhaps the same way many of you have felt from time to time when you're in the supermarket these days, a little bit anxious about maybe what was I exposing myself to, where had other people been, what were the risks, working my way up and down the aisles, getting what I needed. And all of a sudden there was an announcement. It was the store manager. And I've got to admit, when I first heard the PA system go on, I thought, oh, great, we're going to learn that there's a new shipment of toilet paper or hand sanitizer. The truth is that's not what he was about to say. He got onto the PA system actually to address his employees, not even to talk to the shoppers. What he wanted to say, what he said to his employees was, thank you. Thanks for being here. I want to thank all of you for being here during these difficult times to make sure our store can provide services to our customers. His single act of doing that took me out of my anxiety. All of a sudden, I felt a little bit connected to the experience of shopping and to everybody in that store, with appropriate social distance, of course, but that connection was there. As far as I was concerned, what that store manager was doing was an example of expressing appreciation, a form of compassion, and in doing that, elevating the resilience of his employees in that store, letting them know that what they were doing was mattered, that there was a purpose for it. Those are the topics I wanted to share with you and explore through this talk today. The roles of resilience, compassion, and connection, how they can show up in the way in which we lead and interact. To do that, maybe first it would help to step back a second and talk about, especially in these uncertain times, why they matter. They matter so much now because we're dealing with uncertainty. And I guess what I'd like to offer is understand uncertainty as the emotional equivalent of anxiety. Our anxiety comes from the fact that we're dealing with uncertainty. And what we've learned over the years, psychologists have come to understand, is that there are a couple of key things, several key things that drive our sense of uncertainty, our sense of anxiety, and the fear that goes along with them. One is simply disgust, and this is sort of a positive thing, a natural biological thing. We react with anxiety or fear to those things that we find threatening or distasteful, something that tastes bad or something that might hurt us in the environment, like say a virus, right? It's natural to have that reaction to it, part of being human for good reasons. Second, another thing that drives anxiety for us has to do with the rate and intensity at which things are happening. It's not so much maybe that some things are occurring, but when they happen at a pace that feels outside of our control, that's when we're into the space of anxiety. So a second factor. Third, anxiety is about those times in which we feel helpless. And so one way to think about it that makes sense for me, this is a perspective shared by mindfulness expert and psychologist Rick Hansen, is think of anxiety as sort of that gap between what we perceive ourselves to be capable of and what we're experiencing. And that gap, where we don't feel we can control it, that's that anxiety space. It's equivalent to that notion of helplessness. Especially perhaps relevant to our current conversation, anxiety is also the result of the times and ways in which we don't feel confident in our leaders or the people that we look to for guidance. That shows up in a number of different ways. Maybe that's a function of not feeling as though we can trust them, or the extent to which we don't feel as though they're acting with our interests in mind, the ways in which they're indifferent, or the ways in which we just don't feel as though they're capable or competent of meeting our needs or challenges. Those three things in the reverse, when they're going well, are actually the bases the antecedents research has told us for trust. When I feel my leaders are acting with integrity, or when I feel they're acting with benevolence, or when I feel as though they have expertise, those are the things that lead us to trust people. When they're absent, they create that sense of uncertainty, that sense of anxiety. Well, what can we do about it? This is where ideas like tuning into resilience and compassion maybe can help us close that gap between what we feel we're capable of and what we perceive ourselves to be experiencing. So one way I'll encourage you to maybe think about resilience, especially as it applies to ourselves, is through 4 S's. And let me introduce them and see what you think about them. The first S is that we build resilience by staying present. And I mean that in 2 ways. Part of that, one way I mean it, is that it happens because we need to take advantage of being in the present moment. Often when we're feeling anxious, think about how that plays out for us. It's happening because we've gone down some kind of a rabbit hole about worrying what's going to happen next, or worrying about what's going to happen in the future. Yeah, I understand we've got to be concerned about what's happening later, yet sometimes we go too far down that space and we forget that we're okay right now. And that's the space from which we can operate. So staying present, what am I like right now, and tuning into that, really important. Related to that, the point about sort of staying present isn't necessarily to discount or dismiss the way we're feeling. In fact, just the opposite. We've got to tune into it. I sometimes think of the phrase maybe those of you who are parents have used when your children are acting out, and telling them, use your words, express what you're feeling, get in touch with it. Another way that I'd encourage you to think about this is through a mindfulness acronym used in some meditations called RAIN. The idea that in order to process difficult situations, we sort of start by, tuning into first recognizing it, and then allowing it to be there before we kind of investigate, explore what it means for us, and allow ourselves to nurture it. So RAIN, recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. Same thing applies in conflict management. Conflict management experts will tell us that in order to deal with difficult situations, we first have to recognize and deal with the emotions before we can get the facts, before we can get the solutions. So staying present, be in that present moment. I'm okay then. Tune into what's happening in that moment. Second, self-care. And I mean this in terms of taking care of ourselves physically. Really important when we're dealing with stressful times and situations. The sleep that we need, the food that we eat, taking time for exercise, all really important aspects of self-care. Some of you, I read recently, for example, that Winston Churchill, in the midst of all he had to deal with during the Second World War, still took midday naps, not because he didn't care about doing well, but because they helped him to be that much more effective. So self-care, part of it. Self-care also comes from allowing ourselves to be a little bit vulnerable so that we can turn to other people in order to help us accomplish what we need to. By the way, when we do that, we often make others stronger too. Vulnerability, an important part of what enables us to build trust and to lead well. Third, a lot of what drives our sense of anxiety has to do with the way we're interpreting what we're experiencing. So tune into how we're talking about what's happening around us, or more specifically, how we're talking about ourselves, what we're thinking about. The one of the fathers of positive psychologist, Martin Seligman, makes the point that we have to watch out for, avoid those ways in which we're catastrophizing, as he puts it. So by that, meaning that, tune into the ways in which sometimes we allow ourselves to talk in terms of the absolutes. What I'm dealing with is pervasive. My life always sucks, or it's permanent in the sense that it's always going to be this way, or somehow it's personal. That is to say, I'm always going to put the blame directly on me. The point is, few situations really can be characterized that way. And when we turn away from that, when we do the opposite, we create some space. We find some space for action. And that can also come by tuning into the ways in which we've been gritty and expressed determination. How many of you, like me, have learned a lot more, surprisingly more, in the past couple of weeks about communication platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, for example? We're learning things, we're adapting. Turn into that and recognize that when I'm able to do that in certain situations, I can use it and apply it in others as well. So think about how you're talking about the way in which you're reacting to what you're experiencing. The fourth, that kind of builds from creating that sense of efficacy, is to set goals, establish plans, and then try to act on them. Sometimes a goal can even be something as simple as, well, you know what, I don't have all the information yet, but I'm going to wait for more a little bit later and then decide then on what to do. Did any of you recently read about the man in France who ran a marathon on his balcony? That's an example of sort of maybe working in the space of what I can control. Now, I'm not suggesting we all have to go out there and run a marathon in our backyards or on our porches or whatever, but there are examples of sort of working with what we have in our control to be agentic, to make things happen. So another piece of this is enabling resilience. And the way I'd encourage you to think about that is in terms of what we do to help others. Here I'll offer 3 Bs. So the first of those is be present. By that, I mean, take the time to consider, just from the point of view of staying present for ourselves before, this time tune into sort of being present for other people. Asking that question, what do they need? How can I be of help to them in their current situation, is what being present is all about. Really powerful way, to just sort of be there. It's not about sort of saying I've got to change or fix what's going on, but I'm like tuning into where they're at. Sometimes that also includes recognizing that not everyone needs or wants to be treated quite the same way that I might want to be treated. But how am I showing up and allowing space just to be present, allowing others to express their emotions and feelings, for example, as well. Part of that, another way to think about being present, is as befriending. Listening supportively, not necessarily being there to offer answers even, just sort of listening and tuning into what people are saying and hearing. Another way that listening and befriending shows up is by taking some actions. My colleagues and I did some interesting research recently on the important role that actions play in helping other members of a team feel as though they've been listened to or understood. So think about how you're bringing that to bear, especially important in these times where we're working with virtual distance and we don't always have all of the verbal cues and other things that can help us to get a sense for whether or not somebody's actually hearing and listening to us. Another example of this in studies of virtual work is that the best way to convey trust is by responding. Psychologists talk about sort of rapid trust development. Early impressions of whether or not somebody's engaging with me in online environments is a big indicator of whether or not I trust them. Third, and probably this is the big piece of it, just as we talked about building self-efficacy, there are a lot of things you can do to help others feel efficacious, to feel as though they're able to act, a big part of what it means to lead. Do that by expressing appreciation, letting people know where and how they're making a difference. I'm not suggesting here that you've got to make things up, but start tuning into why people are valued on a team and what their strengths are. Make the time to acknowledge it and mention it. That's part just expressing appreciation. Appreciation is also about acknowledging small wins. That builds efficacy and lets people know that progress can be made. Those small wins can be simple as, at least we've established the right priorities here, or got a better understanding of what the problem is. Build that into it. Separate out effort from results. Recognize, especially in these difficult times, that we're not always going to get the ideal results that we want, and to keep it in mind in terms of, recognizing that, I can value at least what people are trying to do and point that out as part of the progress that we're making. I promise you, when we do that and when we apply that, we actually are able to maybe make those results happen, the likelihood of those results happening that much greater, excuse me. Another point that I think matters right now, remember we talked about one of the drivers of anxiety as being that sense of things are happening too fast. And often when we feel anxious, we feel like everything's really coming at us. We lose perspective on time and what's important. So watch out for that false sense of urgency and the ways in which maybe you're bringing that same sense into your interactions with others. Ask yourself, is this really necessary right now? Is it really important right now? Yes, sometimes it is, especially in crises, but be careful of false urgency as well. Finally, we build efficacy by appealing to identity and values, and this is really important. I'll share with you maybe some other points from another recent study that my colleagues and I completed about the values at Great Place to Work companies. One of those colleagues, Dean Prestakos, who you heard from just a few minutes ago, we were interested in understanding how values work in those organizations. There are 2 points from that research that I think are relevant here. One, many of those Great Place to Work companies regard their values as ways to express who they are and what their identity is. And in that sense, they direct attention. So thinking about our values activates our sense of identity, and appeals to identity are powerful tools for allowing change to happen. Really important part of dealing with some of our setbacks. How do I describe what's core to my identity and what's core to my purpose? All part of making that happen. Second, understand how when we talk in terms of values, we're also elevating sort of awareness to what's happening in the present moment. And so I guess an example of what I'm trying to say here is that our values not only direct our attention, but many of these companies, when we talk to them about values, what we were learning is, in fact, they talked about how their values remain constant, but that how the application of the values changed with time. So ask yourself right now, how can I bring my values to bear in these current circumstances, these unique situations, as ways to move ahead? Another tool that can help us with resilience is breaking things down. So this is another tool that psychologists recognize for how we deal with information, but also works in terms of dealing with time and effort, especially important when we're facing challenges. For me right now, by the way, with regard to information, some of what makes me resilient is being, sort of chunking up the way in which I expose myself to the news, for example. But I can be more resilient by not necessarily saying, seeing things as having to happen in one large piece. We're pretty far into social distancing for a while, and it's getting tough. So, not only thinking maybe about trying to last a month from now, but focus on, what am I succeeding at in the next day or so as part of that. Same thing applies to effort, recognizing that, I can break down some of the ways in which I'm putting my effort into managing this new situation, maybe dividing my time between different kinds of activities. There's an example of this when it comes to change too, that if I want to make a change happen, sometimes the best thing to do, one example might be, I've got to clean a big dirty room. Well, don't focus on the big room, maybe focus on just sort of spending a few minutes working in one area of it, and you'll be surprised. Think about how I can break things down. That's what chunking is all about. If it hasn't come across yet, I guess the other big point that we're trying to stress in this talk is that compassion builds resilience. And it doesn't matter what side of that compassionate act you're on. I think that's one of the interesting points. The Dalai Lama told us this before. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Well, his wisdom is also supported by lots of research these days that shows that whatever side we're on of compassionate acts, it seems to activate the same parts of our brain. The same kinds of feelings come to surface And those feelings can be very empowering. They're a source of resilience. When I take the time to do something for somebody else, it helps me to feel agentic too. That's part of that process as well. Still, as we said earlier, this idea of starting with ourselves, self-compassion, really important here. So start with tuning in. Self-compassion, by that I mean, it's different from self-worth. Self-worth sometimes is about, sort of esteem and what I'm like relative to others. It's got an important role in our well-being, but it's different. Self-compassion is about sort of accepting me the way I am, both the negatives and the positives. Again, not ignoring those two sides, but viewing them without judgment. Talking to myself, frankly, the way I might talk to a close friend going through a hard time. Allow ourselves to do that. Develop those sort of mantras that speak from that perspective of, hey, I love you. You're doing well. What a great effort. Talking to ourselves that way actually makes a difference. And one of the ways research has told us it makes a difference is that it actually enables what we call a growth mindset. Growth mindset, really important for driving our capacity to learn and grow from experience, to deal with change and uncertainty. The way that works is when I'm in that growth mindset state, I'm able to see my ability as malleable, capable of changing and capable of growing. And therefore, I'm more receptive to interpreting the feedback in the environment. I'm less likely to feel defeated by setbacks and understand them instead as the natural part of learning and growing. Research tells us that when we sort of think from that self-compassionate perspective, we're actually able to stay in that growth mindset much better. So compassion builds resilience. The other way I've been thinking about compassion, by the way, to make this point too, about compassion being action, is I've been thinking about the movie Die Hard, the first Die Hard film. If you remember, it's the story of John McClane, who single-handedly saves hostages from terrorists inside a Los Angeles skyscraper, except he actually wasn't doing it single-handedly as far as I'm concerned. If you remember, there was another character, Al Powell, and Al wasn't with John McClane physically, but he was with him on the radio throughout the entire experience, listening, engaging with him, letting him know what was working and providing him with information when he could. All of those things, that kind of supportive compassion enabled John's resilience. There's plenty of examples, other examples from films, history, art, literature, and so on. But of course, we don't have to go all the way back to all of those things to get to it. We're seeing it happen right now. Some of you may have been hearing the story across Europe of the ways in which people have been taking to their balconies to applause and support other people. So lots of examples, things like that happening around us. That's adding resilience for those healthcare workers, but it's also making those of us who are expressing compassion more resilient as well. It's a way in which we can make a difference. So your compassion is action, it is agency, and it helps to build resilience. So as we wrap up for today, start then to think about what's your checklist. What's your list of things that you can be doing maybe to be more resilient and compassionate in relation to yourself? I'm offering on this slide some examples, whether it's in terms of your self-care plan or reflecting on your values or even taking time to laugh. But come up with your own list too, and maybe try to make it happen. Likewise, maybe think about what you might be doing for others, the ways in which are you making time to express appreciation? How are you showing up and being present and responsive? What are you doing to point out all of those small wins, all of those things as examples of ways to do this? I'm drawing in this talk from lots of information from areas that I think can also help. Beyond this time that we've spent together, I'd encourage you to turn to some of those resources too, to build your sense of resilience. Much of what I've talked about has come from the literature on mindfulness. Learn more about Harold Dweck's work on growth mindset, or the notion of grit developed by Angela Duckworth. It helps to understand a little bit more about positive psychology. That's the study of what we're like when we're at our best. And later in this series, you'll be hearing from some of my colleagues. The next talk is from my colleague, Don Lombardi, who's going to go further into some ideas about leadership. And later in this talk, in this series too, you'll hear from my colleague, Wei Zheng, who's going to talk some more about inclusive leadership as a strategy. So lots to keep thinking about. And by thinking about it, we can develop our resilience. I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time talking to you about these ideas and would look forward to hearing more from you in the future as well. I want to know what did we talk about today that maybe is helpful for you? What do you know that you could share? What are you experiencing that you think might be beneficial to others? I'd love to hear from you, and maybe we can collect it and get it back out there to keep this dialogue going. Until then, please be well, be safe, and thank you for spending this time with me.